The liberation of France in the summer of 1944 was, by any military measure, one of the most extraordinary feats of organized force in modern history. 3 million Allied troops crossed the English Channel, fought through hedgerow country, shattered German armor along roads that had not seen free traffic in 4 years, and handed back to ordinary French men and women the simple right to open their own front doors without fear. Towns that had lived under occupation since 1940 erupted. There were flags. There were tears. There were old men who had not wept in decades standing in rubble-strewn squares, weeping openly. And then some American officers helped themselves to the furniture. Now, that sentence deserves a moment to land because the full picture of what happened in certain liberated French communes during the summer and autumn of 1944 is not the story that gets told at memorial ceremonies. It is not on the plaques. It is not in the regimental histories that families display on shelves. But it is in the records, the complaint logs filed by French prefects, the after-action reports that junior officers dared to submit upward through the chain of command, and in the private letters of soldiers who watched it happen and could not quite believe what they were seeing. Looting by individual soldiers in wartime is, tragically, as old as warfare itself. Military historians have documented it across every army, every conflict, every century. But what made the incidents inside Patton's Third Army Theater particularly corrosive was not the act of a desperate private pocketing a watch. It was officers, men with rank insignia, men who commanded the respect and obedience of enlisted soldiers beneath them, men whose behavior set the moral temperature of every unit they led. Those men were the ones directing the removal of property from civilian homes and businesses in towns that had just been freed. The geography matters here. By late July and into August of 1944, Patton's Third Army had been activated and was tearing through Brittany and into the Loire Valley at a speed that stunned even the Germans. The breakout from Saint-Lô, Operation Cobra, had cracked the front open, and Patton, finally unleashed after months of enforced idleness following the slapping incidents in Sicily, drove his men with an almost ferocious energy. Towns fell in succession: Rennes, Laval, Le Mans. The pace was exhilarating, and in that exhilaration, discipline in rear area units that were not fighting but were consolidating and administering, began to fray in ways that would demand a reckoning. You see, not every soldier in the Third Army was at the sharp end of the advance. For every tanker pushing toward the Seine, there were quartermasters, supply officers, liaison teams, and administrative personnel moving through towns that had already been secured. Towns where the fighting had passed and where French civilians were trying to piece their lives back together. And it was in this administrative rear, in this gray zone between combat and occupation, that the theft began. The complaints that reached French civil authorities and eventually filtered up to American military government officers described a pattern that was not random. Shop windows that had survived German occupation intact were found broken. Homes that had been locked were found entered. Furniture, chairs, clocks, silverware, mirrors was reported missing. In at least several documented cases, military vehicles, American Army trucks, were observed being loaded with civilian property by men in uniform. French mayors filed formal written protests. Some of those protests survive in the archives of the Service Historique de la Défense in Vincennes and in the records of the Allied military government detachments. Well, the question was always, who would actually do something about it? The formal mechanism existed. The Articles of War, which governed American military conduct, included provisions that covered the theft of property from civilian populations. A court-martial could theoretically have been convened, but courts-martial were slow. They were public in a legalistic way that generated paperwork, witnesses, defense counsel, appeals. They were, in short, the kind of process that could embarrass not just the accused but the entire command structure above them. And in the summer of 1944, with the liberation of Europe unfolding and newsreel cameras following American forces through cheering French crowds, the last thing senior commanders wanted on the wire services was a story about U.S. officers on trial for stealing a widow's clock. George Smith Patton Jr. had been fighting that instinct toward institutional self-protection his entire career, usually, it must be said, as the object of it rather than its beneficiary. The slapping incidents in Sicily in August of 1943 had nearly ended him. He had struck 2 hospitalized soldiers he accused of malingering Private Charles Coole on August 3rd and Private Paul Bennett on August 10th, and the story, suppressed for weeks, eventually broke through journalist Drew Pearson's radio broadcast in November of that year. General Dwight Eisenhower had seriously considered relieving Patton of command permanently. The public fury was real and sustained. Patton survived, but the experience left marks. It also, paradoxically, sharpened his understanding of something that most senior commanders preferred to leave vague: the difference between discipline enforced through the system and discipline enforced through the authority of command presence. The court-martial was the system's tool. What Patton reached for, in the right circumstances, was something more immediate, more personal, and in its own way more devastating. According to a combat report filed through Third Army administrative channels in the late summer of 1944, a military police officer noted simply, "Civilian complaints of property removal by uniformed personnel have been received from 3 separate commune mayors." That report moved up the chain. It reached officers who could have filed it quietly. One of them, to his credit, made sure it did not stop there. The specific incident that would bring Patton himself into direct confrontation with the officers responsible involved a small commune, the kind of place that does not appear in the grand strategic histories, but that exists, still, as a collection of stone houses around a church square, the kind of place where everybody knows what was taken and from whose house. The details of the commune's name, in the accounts that have been cross-referenced, are variously rendered or deliberately obscured in post-war documentation, a common feature of records dealing with Allied misconduct in France. What is not obscured is the character of what happened, because multiple enlisted men witnessed it, and several of them eventually described it in letters, in post-war interviews, in the kinds of accounts that oral historians collected from veterans decades later. A small group of American officers, the accounts suggest between 3 and 5 men of varying rank, at least 2 of them holding the rank of captain or above, had, over the course of several days spent in or near a secured town, systematically entered civilian properties and removed valuables. The operation was not frenzied or impulsive. It had the quality of deliberate selection. Certain items were taken, others were left. This was not hungry desperation. This was acquisitive calculation by men who wore the uniform of a liberating army. Listen, the French civilians in that town had done everything that was asked of them. They had endured 4 years of German occupation. They had fed the resistance when they could. They had watched their sons and daughters disappear into labor conscription, and their food disappear into Wehrmacht requisition orders. And when the Americans came through, they had stood in their doorways and wept with gratitude. Because the Americans were supposed to be different. They were supposed to be the ones who did not do this. When Patton received the full report, not a filtered summary, but the actual written complaints from French civil authorities, cross-referenced with the military police logs, his response had a quality that multiple accounts describe in remarkably similar terms. It was not explosive. It was cold. The rage was there, but it was controlled, compressed into something more purposeful than a tirade. The officers had not merely stolen. They had stolen from people his army had liberated. They had taken the moral authority of the entire campaign and used it as cover for personal enrichment. Every French man and woman who saw American soldiers load civilian property onto a military truck would carry that image. The damage was not just to a clock or a mirror. It was to the narrative of liberation itself. And George Patton, whatever his many documented faults, understood narratives. He had spent his entire career performing the idea of the American warrior general with a theatrical precision that his critics called vanity and his admirers called genius. He knew what the uniform meant. He knew what it cost when men in that uniform behaved like the forces they had been sent to defeat. The officers were summoned, not to a formal proceeding. There was no JAG officer present, no articles of war citation read aloud, no defense counsel seated at a table. They were brought before Patton directly, in a setting that was deliberately chosen for its visibility because visibility was the point. This was not going to be a quiet reassignment buried in transfer orders. This was going to be a reckoning in front of witnesses. The assembled regiment or a significant portion of it. The accounts vary on the precise number but agree it was a formation large enough to constitute public stood at attention. The accused officers stood forward, and Patton spoke. The content of what he said is not preserved in a single verbatim record, because this was not a court proceeding and no stenographer was present. But the substance has been reconstructed through multiple first-hand accounts from enlisted men who were there, accounts that agree on the essential points even where they differ on specific phrases. Patton did not lecture them about international law or the Articles of War. He described what they had done in terms so blunt and physical and specific that several men who witnessed it later said they could not repeat it in mixed company. He used the word theft. He used it repeatedly, without softening. He described the people they had stolen from their ages, their circumstances, the years they had survived before Americans arrived. He made the officers stand there and absorb that in front of every man beneath them in rank. According to an account later related by a 3rd Army staff sergeant and preserved in a post-war oral history collection, one witness remembered, he said they had disgraced the uniform in front of the people we came to free. The humiliation was precise and total. These were men whose authority over enlisted soldiers had rested on the assumption of a moral baseline. Officers were held to a higher standard. It was the foundational premise of military hierarchy. Patton stripped that premise away in public. He did not merely demote or reassign them in a document. He performed their disgrace before the men they had commanded, which ensured that every soldier in that formation would carry the image for the rest of the war and beyond the image of what happened when officers forgot what the uniform was for. What would you have done, standing in command at that moment, facing officers who had stolen not just property but the trust of every French civilian watching American soldiers pass through their town? Tell me in the comments, because what Patton did in the aftermath made clear this was only the beginning of the reckoning. The formal consequences followed the public humiliation. The officers were relieved of command, stripped of the positions they held. In the context of the 3rd Army's combat operations in the summer of 1944, relief of command was not a minor administrative inconvenience. It was the end of a military career arc. Officers who had trained for years, who had crossed the Atlantic with the expectation of leading men in the campaign that would define their generation, those men were now going nowhere near combat command again. They were reassigned to administrative posts, to supply depots, to the kind of rear area functions that carried no honor and no prospect of the decorations and promotions that combat service generated. In the military culture of 1944, where a man's war record would follow him into the civilian economy for decades, this was a sentence with no release date. Now, the formal record here becomes deliberately murky, and the murkiness itself is historically significant. The 3rd Army's official unit records do not carry detailed accounts of this episode in the way that, say, a successful tank engagement would be logged and cited. This is a consistent feature of how Allied military command handled internal misconduct during the Liberation campaign. French civilian complaint records were processed through military government channels that operated largely separately from combat unit records. The result is a historical gap, an episode that is documented in its constituent parts but not assembled into a single clean narrative in any one archive. This matters because it means the story survived not in official histories but in the memories of the men who were present, and those memories are not uniform. Some accounts emphasize Patton's restraint, the fact that he chose humiliation over court-martial, which, given the potential for broader scandal, was arguably as much a protective decision as a punitive one. Other accounts emphasize his fury, the sense that what he felt watching officers steal from liberated civilians was something beyond professional outrage, something closer to personal offense at the desecration of everything he believed the American military was supposed to represent. Both readings are probably true simultaneously. Patton was never a simple man, and his relationship with military justice was famously complicated. He had been on the receiving end of it often enough to understand its arbitrary texture. He had also, in Sicily, crossed a line himself, struck 2 enlisted men in a military hospital, one of them visibly suffering from combat stress, and had escaped the career-ending consequences of that through Eisenhower's intervention and his own strategic indispensability. He was not a man without self-awareness about the gap between the standards he demanded of others and the standards he sometimes applied to himself. But on this specific question, the looting of civilian property by American officers in liberated French territory, the accounts are consistent. His intolerance was absolute, and it was enacted. The French civilians who eventually received confirmation that the officers responsible had been punished, and word did travel through the commune networks, through the mayors and the local resistance figures who had contact with military government officers, responded with something more complicated than simple satisfaction. Several accounts describe a kind of exhausted relief, the relief of people who had learned not to expect too much from institutions, but who had been, in this instance, surprised. One French mayor, in a letter to an American military government officer preserved in the archives of the National World War II Museum in New Orleans, wrote in French that translated roughly as, "We did not know if you would act. We are grateful that someone did." That sentence, "we did not know if you would act," carries more historical weight than it might initially seem, because it reflects the fundamental uncertainty that liberation created for French civilians. The Germans had been predictably bad. The Americans were supposed to be something different, but supposed to be is not a guarantee, and 4 years of occupation had taught these communities that promises made by men with guns had a flexible relationship with reality. The fact that Patton acted publicly, immediately, without waiting for the formal machinery of military justice to grind through its months-long process, mattered precisely because it was visible. It was the kind of accountability that civilians could see and verify with their own eyes. By the autumn of 1944, as Third Army continued its eastward push toward the German border crossing the Moselle, battering toward the Saar, the memory of what Patton had done in that town square settled into the institutional culture of the units that had witnessed it. It became one of those stories that circulates through a military organization at the level of enlisted men and junior officers, the kind of story that does not appear in official doctrine but that shapes behavior, because everyone knows it happened and everyone knows what it cost the men involved. According to a letter written home by a Third Army corporal in late 1944 and later donated to a university archive by the soldier's family, he wrote, "The general made them stand up in front of God and everyone." That phrase, "in front of God and everyone," is not military terminology. It is the language of a man describing something that operated below the level of official procedure, at the level of human accountability, the kind of reckoning that happens when someone in authority decides that the formal mechanism is not sufficient, and that what is required instead is witness. Patton's command philosophy, in its most stripped-down form, rested on the belief that soldiers performed at the level of what was expected of them, and that expectations were set not by regulations printed in field manuals, but by the behavior of the men above them in the chain of command. This was the principle he applied with brutal consistency to tactical performance. He would relieve a general who failed to advance more quickly than he would a private who broke under fire, because the general had chosen his profession, and the private had been drafted. The same logic extended downward to questions of conduct. If officers looted, enlisted men would loot. If officers stole from the people they had liberated, the moral framework of the entire campaign was compromised from the top. This was not a theoretical concern. The political dimension of the liberation campaign was something that Eisenhower, Marshall, and the senior Allied command structure understood with great clarity, perhaps more clarity than the public realized at the time. The relationship between the Allied military forces and the French civilian population was being managed with considerable diplomatic care, because the question of what France would look like after liberation, which political factions would govern it, what role the Free French forces under de Gaulle would play, all of that was live and contested throughout the summer and autumn of 1944. Incidents of American misconduct toward French civilians had the potential to ripple outward into political consequences that went far beyond the immediate military situation. The looting incidents were therefore doubly dangerous. They were individually unjust individual French civilians, already impoverished by 4 years of occupation, having what little they possessed stolen by the soldiers who had supposedly come to restore their freedom. And they were institutionally dangerous evidence that the gap between the liberation narrative and the liberation reality was not being policed, which was exactly the kind of evidence that could be exploited by political actors who had their own reasons to complicate Franco-American relations in the post-liberation period. Patton's response, whatever its motivations, served both levels simultaneously. The individual officers were punished in a way that was visible and unambiguous. The signal sent to the broader command structure was clear, and the French civil authorities who had filed the complaints received confirmation that their complaints had been taken seriously, that the American military was capable of holding its own accountable, at least in this instance, at least when the commanding general decided to make it so. The broader campaign continued. The war was not over. By December of 1944, the Germans had launched the Ardennes counteroffensive, what Americans would come to call the Battle of the Bulge, and Patton's Third Army would execute one of the most extraordinary operational pivots in the history of armored warfare, turning 90 degrees north in brutal winter conditions to relieve the besieged garrison at Bastogne. The looting episode receded into the background of a war that kept generating new emergencies at a pace that left little room for retrospection. But it did not disappear. The officers who had been publicly humiliated and stripped of command did not recover their former positions. The war ended for them, professionally, in a town square in liberated France. Whatever they had imagined for themselves, the decorations, the post-war career advancement, the veterans' honor of having served in command during the campaign that freed Europe, gone, replaced by the knowledge that the men they had once led had watched them stripped of rank and dignity in front of a formation, on orders from a general who considered what they had done a betrayal of everything the uniform was supposed to mean. There is a particular kind of justice that operates outside formal legal systems, not lawless, not arbitrary, but calibrated to a different standard of visibility and consequence. Patton understood this perhaps better than any senior American commander of his generation, partly because he had experienced both the protection and the exposure that institutional power could offer. He knew that the court-martial system could bury a story as easily as it could resolve one. He knew that a formal acquittal or a lenient sentence, achieved through the mechanisms of military legal procedure, would tell the enlisted men watching exactly nothing about where the real moral lines of the command were drawn. What he chose instead, the public reckoning, the full regiment assembled, the officers standing forward in their disgrace, told them everything. Well, the liberated French towns along the Third Army's route of advance are quiet now. The stone houses still stand. The church squares still hold their morning markets. The older residents, the ones old enough to have been children in 1944, carry the memory of that summer, in the way that people carry the memories of extraordinary times with a complexity that resists simple summary. The Americans came, the Germans left, and in between, things happened that the official histories do not always record fully. Some of those things were acts of extraordinary courage and sacrifice. Some were acts of ordinary human weakness dressed in the uniform of liberation. And in one town on one day, a general with pearl-handled revolvers and a reputation for profanity and a gift for the theater of command, stood in front of his men and refused to look away from what his own officers had done. The French mayor who wrote, "We did not know if you would act," was describing something that every person who has ever lived under a powerful institution and then waited to see whether that institution would hold its own accountable, every such person understands in their gut without needing it. Explained. The machinery of justice is only as real as the moments when it actually moves. When it moves visibly, publicly, at cost to the people it is meant to govern, that is when it becomes something more than machinery. Patton's Third Army crossed the Rhine at Oppenheim on the 22nd of March, 1945, becoming the first Allied force to cross that river since Napoleon. The war in Europe ended 6 weeks later. Patton himself was dead by December of that year, killed in a road accident outside Mannheim on the 9th, dying 12 days later on the 21st of December, 1945, in a military hospital in Heidelberg. He was 60 years old. The men he had commanded, the men who had stood in that formation and watched officers stripped of everything they had traded their integrity for, those men went home. They became fathers, mechanics, farmers, insurance salesmen. They carried the war inside them the way all of them did, in fragments and flashes, in the particular way that extraordinary experience lodges in ordinary lives, and some of them, in letters and interviews and the careful testimony of old age, kept coming back to that moment in the town square. Not the battles, not the crossings and the advances and the famous drives across France. That moment, specifically, the general, the officers, the silence of the formation. Never underestimate what it means to a soldier, to any person bound by hierarchy and obligation, to witness the powerful held accountable. It does not happen often enough. When it does, it lasts.